Welcome to our panel. Yeah, lessons from the Civil War. Every time, over the past 2 weeks, when I mentioned when the conference came up, people would mention this panel as the one that we're looking forward to. So I think there's
no pressure.
No pressure at all. Yeah. I think the way we're gonna do it, so let's immediately disappoint everyone. I don't think we're gonna turn it into a boxing match. Really, we got Twitter for that. Yeah, the Civil War, I know it's kind of 2 years ago, and I think we want to, discuss what happened, where we agree, disagree. Not really interested in rehashing the whole block size arguments again.
Yeah, let's not do that.
Yeah. What else? Yeah, we did. So to let you into a little secret, these kinds of panels are often, before the panel happens, the panelists and the moderator usually have sort of a pre-panel discussion of what they'll discuss, and then, that doesn't mean the panel is scripted, but it's a little bit prepared of what's coming up. We didn't really do that this time. We wanted to have the conversation be a bit more spontaneous and natural, I guess. So Erik and Erik don't really know what questions I'm gonna ask, really. Yeah, I guess let's get into it. So I didn't introduce myself, I think. So I'm Adam from Wirdum. I'm technical editor at Bitcoin Magazine. I think everyone knows you guys, but still, let's introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Erik Lombrozo. I'm CEO of Ciphrex, and I've been working on Bitcoin protocol development for a while.
And I'm Erik Voorhees, founder and CEO of ShapeShift.
All right. Okay, so the goal of this conference, the idea that David Bailey and the team had was to kind of leave the past and move forward and see where we actually agree on and refocus. Now, our panel is actually also going to be about stuff we might disagree on, but I would suggest real quick, let's see if we also agree somewhere. What do you guys, for you, what's interesting about Bitcoin? Why are you in this space? Why does Bitcoin matter? Let's start there.
With me?
Sure, yeah, Erik.
So Bitcoin for me is really about financial freedom and about being able to opt out of oppressive systems. And I think right now we're seeing what's happening with the current financial system and fiat money, the way that it's just, everything that's happening right now. I think having a way to opt out peacefully is super critical. The only alternative to this, and we see in history when fiat money fails, usually there's war. And Bitcoin offers an alternative to war. So I hope that we can find a way to achieve a better a more financially free world without needing to have a World War III or something.
Yeah, there's certainly an irony in having a panel about a civil war when the entire point of the technology is really for peace.
Right.
I mean, we agree 100% on this. Bitcoin, to me, represents the future foundation of the entire world's financial system, built on an open free market structure that is borderless, that is apolitical. And that vision, I think, is incredibly powerful. That vision has persisted since I got involved many years ago. And I think that's the vision that I think has inspired so many people toward it.
All right. Yeah, so Civil War, let's get into that then. Erik, you were part of the SegWit2x agreement.
Yeah.
There's also a lot of new people maybe in the space that weren't there. Can you explain from your perspective, how did that come to be? What was the context at that point? Why did you sign up for it? Were you, because it was sort of drafted in a hotel room, or I don't know, were you there? Or
I was not even in a hotel room,
okay.
Contrary to popular belief. I think to understand that there was 1 or 2 years of increasing intense discussion over the issue of Bitcoin's scalability, how many transactions it could handle, how many it should handle, and if that amount was going to be increased, how it could be done. And there were sort of several trains of thought on this. One was it doesn't need to handle any more transactions. It's good as it is. Another was it needs to handle lots of transactions and bring on the whole world so that people can be using it for all sorts of things. And then there were some very clever technical proposals like segregated witness, which allowed more transactions to happen in a very interesting way, and also provided some further safety for the blockchain. And this debate is really a nuanced technical debate, and it was really tragic to see how bitter and vitriolic it got. My own position was basically that there were probably a lot of different paths that Bitcoin could take, and that it might be reasonable to have both moderately larger block sizes, not infinitely larger, and also SegWit to me seemed like an obvious solution, an obvious upgrade that would help the network. So trying to be a pragmatist, I saw one side wanting one thing and another side wanting another thing, and I was like, maybe a little bit of both here would be good. And a lot of other people in the Bitcoin business community had similar feelings, and so long story short, there was a group of people that got together and said, okay, if we can get the miners to agree to incorporate SegWit into the protocol, if that's done with a moderate block size increase, maybe like this civil war can be done and we can all move on and Bitcoin will be more scalable and we'll have SegWit finally. And so I thought that was reasonable, and I wanted to push it forward. I was tired of seeing the whole community stagnate for 2 years, for SegWit not getting anywhere for over a year. And so I agreed to endorse that deal. And after that, obviously, we devolved into an even more bitter feud. And instead of bringing the community together, I think it further drove it apart. And so that was really tragic.
Yeah, so when this agreement was published at first, Erik, you were totally against it, like right from the start.
Can we back up a little bit?
Okay,
yeah,
sure.
there's a lot more history before that whole agreement happened, right? So I started working on Bitcoin protocol development around 2011, and back then there was a certain process that existed with the open source community. And at the time, there wasn't too much of, the business side of Bitcoin was still very, very much in infancy. There were very few companies that were, there were some startups for sure, like the economy was tiny. And I think that there was just a very different way that people understood the process, the development process. And when I started working on Bitcoin protocol development, I really wanted to be able to add new features and fix the problems that I noticed. 'Cause, I noticed that it had issues. Obviously it was, the first draft isn't necessarily going to be perfect, but I realized just how difficult it is to change Bitcoin. And that is kind of its main feature in a way. So it's kind of like, it was kind of like this catch-22, right? Because I wanted to be able to add all these things that I thought were cool. And that's why I actually worked on other projects besides Bitcoin. I realized that the other projects actually have probably more issues than Bitcoin now. But I think there was a misunderstanding as far as the process. And I don't think that most people actually had bad intentions at all. I think most people that actually were participating in this really did want to see this go forward and really wanted to see more use, more and more adoption. And I think that it's great. But I also think that a lot of people maybe underestimated the difficulty of a lot of this stuff and just how early we are, and how many technical issues and other issues also on the social front need to be addressed to be able to do these kinds of changes. The first time that I actually saw a block size proposal increase, block size increase proposal proposed on the mailing list was around 2015. I know that this stuff had been discussed before, but it wasn't really discussed as part of the process of the open source community that I was familiar with. And I think that there was kind of like a disconnect at that point. And there's kind of like different camps formed which had different ideas of the future of Bitcoin. And I think that even though most people did have good intentions, there were some bad actors in there that definitely did want to cause problems. And Bitcoin is a potential threat to some major power players right now. So there could be people that are interested in actually causing schisms and introducing these kinds of problems.
Do you think that as well, Erik? Like, were there bad actors involved as well, other than the honest people on both sides?
Bitcoin certainly has lots of enemies. I don't think Bitcoin's enemies were really involved in the discussion. And part of the result of that was that those involved in the discussion started seeing and making enemies out of each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. I think that I don't think the enemies deliberately created intentionally, like at the beginning. But I think that once that the conflict was there, it was exploited by people that had other intentions. Not necessarily Bitcoin enemies, like as far as like nation states, but even people that just wanted to print their own money, create their own coins, and kind of use the marketing behind Bitcoin to be able to pump their own stuff, right? So I think that there was a lot of confusion at that point. And when I saw this block size increase proposal, I actually really wanted to see if it was possible to make this happen. So I went out and talked to all the people that I considered the best protocol experts and asked them, and discussed, really, is this feasible? And it became quickly apparent that actually deploying something like this and making sure that the network doesn't fork was an extremely, extremely difficult problem. And this is where SegWit came about. I was one of the co-authors of the SegWit BIP, and so this proposal was able to find a way to increase the block size without losing backwards compatibility. What this means is that old software could continue to run on the network without needing to be upgraded, and it would still remain on the same network. Whereas if you need an incompatible hard fork, what that means is that all the old nodes that don't upgrade get left behind. Basically, they end up on a separate network. And we've already seen that happen with the forks now, but I think that back in 2015, people just had not really witnessed this yet, so they didn't actually know the dynamics. Everything was still very much theory. Now we actually have empirical data as to what happens to this. And I think that, unfortunately, by the time that I was made aware of this, there were already some hostilities that existed between other people that weren't necessarily just technical. I mean, there were just different differences of opinion and different things, different interests at play, and not necessarily malicious, just people that have different interests, right? And I think that that's part of the fundamental dynamics of Bitcoin, is that there are going to be different players with different interests, and there's checks and balances, and that's the way that the system works. In this case, I think that the system of checks and balances almost broke. It didn't break, but the community did split, but maybe that was inevitable. I think that if we look at history, it's really hard to keep a large group of people together for a very long time, and that's kind of why nation states formed in the first place. We're kind of trying to find something better than that. It's extremely ambitious, and I think it's really, really, we need to understand and appreciate just how difficult it is to make these changes.
Yeah, let me jump in there, because you've mentioned this a couple of times. One of the value propositions of Bitcoin is that it's hard to change, backwards compatibility. Do you agree with that, Erik? Or because SegWit 2x, like that's sort of, the opposite of that in a way, or how do you feel about that?
Clearly, Bitcoin is very hard to change, and clearly that is one of its most important attributes. There also probably needs to be a distinction between something that is hard to change and something that is impossible to change. And in a technology as new as blockchains generally, and in a market that changes, in a world that's changing, a completely brittle, intractable system is unlikely to succeed. And as someone who has been very interested in seeing Bitcoin take over the world since 2011, I have always been very worried that if it became too brittle and if it could not ever change or upgrade in any way, it would simply be outcompeted by some other crypto. And in some ways, that's fine. I mean, ultimately, the goal of crypto would live on in that other coin. But first and foremost, I'm a Bitcoiner, and that project is the most important blockchain in the world. And so I want that one to win, and I think for that, it needs to be able to change sometimes, and when and how that happens is a really difficult debate.
Right, so in the end, SegWit 2x was cancelled. You were definitely one of the signatories of the email that cancelled it, I think, right?
Yeah.
So why was it cancelled, or how was the decision made? Were you did someone believe it was a bad idea in the end, or was it?
Yeah. So the history was, after the SegWit 2x proposal, or it was called the New York Agreement back then before it was written into code, the idea was that SegWit would activate soon, like weeks after that, and then 2 or 3 or 4 months later, there would be a hard fork to a doubling of the block size. And so that first part, the SegWit upgrade, happened, and that was great. Super glad that part of it happened. And then there were like 3 months of horrible, bickering, contentious debate in the community about that second part of it, the doubling of the base block size. Those of us who called it off, it had become very clear that there was not a preponderance of support among the community. And critics of us, I think, understandably point out or say that there was never any significant support for it, and you should have known that earlier. That was not clear at the start. It became clear, and by the time it was clear to us, we said, okay, let's not move forward with this. But it was a noisy community, and we felt, those of us who had put that deal together, we felt there was an obligation to carry it through because the mining community had actually carried through the upgrade into SegWit. And so then you get into kind of an ethical question of like, if you do a deal and the other side performs that deal, but a bunch of loud people on Twitter are telling you not to do it anymore, what's the ethical answer there? And that was a struggle. But eventually it really became clear that it was too contentious. And so it was called off a couple weeks before the fork itself.
Would it have been, I think a lot of anger is that this option of calling it off was not included in the initial sort of presentation. Like, do you think in retrospect it would have been good to just say like, if there's not enough community support, then we won't do it, but this is sort of what we want to do, or more as a proposal than...
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to suggest such a thing, but if such a thing was part of the agreement, the likelihood that the mining community would have accepted it and upgraded SegWit, or you know, that wouldn't have been very likely. So it kind of had to be a both thing. Like, you know, you guys give on this one side and we give on the other, and both things can happen. And so that's what made it hard. And I really struggled with that ethical dilemma of, you know, being there and supporting a cause when another side had performed their end.
All right, slightly different topic from SegWit2x. I'd like to...
Well, can I just respond?
Oh, yeah, sure.
I was going to say that from my perspective, really, I mean, I consider myself a pragmatist when it comes to this. I'm not like a Bitcoin maximalist or like, you know, I mean, basically anything that's going to work, that's what I want to use. And as far as this fork stuff, for me, it's really a matter of whether it's even feasible, whether it's possible to do. I never actually took a position on block size. I was actually very open to the possibility of increasing block size, and actually the SegWit proposal increased block size. It was more the deployment mechanism and the fact that if you don't do this right, you are going to get a fork, you are going to get a split in the chain, and that's just going to divide the entire economy. And obviously, that's not a sustainable model going forward for development. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, all right. So the other topic would be UASF, BIP 148. You were a supporter of that. I think you, if I recall correctly, I think you sort of really started to throw your weight or back that proposal around the same time of the SegWit2x. Mm-hmm. I remember like a Twitter photo with a bull with a... Anyways, maybe you can sort of provide some context there. Why did you decide that, or what's the...
Sure. So the way that the changes to the Bitcoin protocol had been deployed in the past had been through backwards compatible soft forks primarily. That's the main mechanism. But in order to be able to make sure that it's smooth, you want to make sure that the hash power is behind the fork before you do it. However, the hash power measuring, the actual metrics used for that was never meant to be a political process. It wasn't actually intended to be a voting mechanism. It was just intended to be a safety mechanism for deployment to make sure that once people agree on something, the network doesn't have any interruptions of service or splits or stuff like that. I think that this was very misunderstood. I think that there were some miners at the time that were thinking that the checks and balances of the system worked a little bit differently, and tried to push proposals by basically trying to throw more hash power behind things. But the thing is that if you throw hash power behind an incompatible thing and the main network doesn't accept your blocks, you're just not going to get paid for them, right? And so it became clear that there was this whole game theory side of it. There was this thing which we wanted the miners to signal for in order to be able to have the smooth transition into SegWit. But at the same time, there were some miners that were trying to use this, to kind of as a political or as a negotiation tactic. I'm not going to say it's political, but a negotiation tactic, right? And like Erik was pointing out, I mean, I think negotiations in business are, it's typical to handle things this way, and definitely, you want to make sure that both sides are at least, equally unsatisfied, right, with the result. But in the case of a peer-to-peer consensus network, that doesn't really work that well, because you have all these different players with different interests inherently, and the checks and balances have to be at the level of the incentives of the actual network itself. So you cannot really make these kinds of deals, and so it was not really possible to talk to the miners and say, okay, you guys do this and we'll do this. The network had to accept this. So the UASF, the user-activated soft fork, was a way to add pressure to miners, so that, financial incentive for them to follow the chain that was deploying SegWit. And I think that it worked. I mean, there were forks that happened after that. Some people wanted to had different ideas for what to do with that, but I think it really clearly demonstrated the dynamics of that. And the fact that if you do want to have an incompatible change and get everyone to join your network, it's an extremely difficult problem. And the 2x stuff was extremely ambitious to try to get everyone to on board for that. I just didn't think that it was possible to make that happen. And so I was just basically betting on the chain that I thought was going to be the most successful one, given all the dynamics and all the game theory and everything.
Would you like to comment to UASF? Like why didn't you support it, for example, or what's your reasoning there, or?
From back then, I think from what I saw, it was a very contentious and hostile relationship between a group of people and the mining community, and I felt that was extremely dangerous. So yeah, I didn't support that. It seemed overwhelmingly that the mining hash power did not support that, and I was very worried about ultimately a chain split hard fork situation that would really disrupt Bitcoin. Tragically, and one of the great ironies of the whole scaling debate and how to upgrade the protocol was trying to avoid a risk of a chain split and a fork, and we all failed in that. Bitcoin ultimately did fork, and then that fork has forked several times. And I think to those of us before the Bitcoin Cash fork, we really wanted to keep the whole community together and see if that could be done. And we all failed in that. But I think, years later now, it's one of the interesting parts of blockchain technology generally is that those differences of expression and opinion can both be manifest. So people who disagree on protocol level stuff can go their own ways, neither one harming the other. And I think this is a really interesting element of blockchain governance. It shows how a peaceful open market of this very interesting technology can split, and communities can go off and do their own thing without harming each other. I think there's something really beautiful in that, and probably as we get further away from the contentious days of that era, people will see that as a virtue of blockchains.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think that's an interesting point, because I don't disagree, but do you also see a risk there? Like in this case, the split was relatively clean, I would say. Both communities sort of went their own way. There's still some bad blood, but it's at least sort of clear for most people, sort of this is Bitcoin and this is Bitcoin Cash, like that kind of different names. Do you think, like if SegWit 2x would have gone through, for example, then maybe you have the hash power on one end, users on the other, and like a much bigger fight, or like this? Do you see a risk there, like where governance could really fail, or where if there's really different ideas of what Bitcoin actually is and how it's worked or how it's governed?
Yeah, and this goes back to why SegWit 2x was eventually called off before the fork part. SegWit 2x was never intended to be a fork that splits the chain and causes two different coins. The goal was that some supermajority, it would be very clear that a supermajority went in a certain direction, and that would just be the upgrade of the Bitcoin chain. As that was less and less certain, it became more and more appropriate to call it off, and that's ultimately what happened.
You want to comment on this?
Well, I think, we don't have too much time left, but I just want to say that, I really hope that, I totally agree with Erik that the fact that we were able to split peacefully is a good thing. I would have liked to be able to remain a single community. I think it's extremely difficult to scale a large community of people and keep it together. It's amazing that that the Bitcoin community has kept together, or that we were able to have conferences like this and that people actually support this idea. It seems like there is a really, really strong movement here. But I think that it's just the fact that people can kind of split off and let the financial markets kind of decide stuff without having to fire a single bullet is a huge achievement. And so I hope that we can bring more unity. But I think that there's going to be forks and there's going to be people promoting other stuff and trying. And this is it's not going to be a smooth ride for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're kind of out of time. Let me ask you guys one last question. Lessons from a civil war. What's your lesson if you'd have to? Like, do you feel you would have done anything differently if it would happen again, or if
Yeah, I think the biggest tragedy of the whole situation was not any technical disagreement. It wasn't that anything forked. It was the hatred and vitriol that bubbled up in that community, in this community. It got really bad, and people that have been in this world for a while, there's a camaraderie that is very powerful, and that got completely shattered during that period. I think most people have blame in that to one degree or another, and Twitter maybe has the most blame of all. Probably the lesson is that, like, in contentious issues, do not debate them on Twitter. Like, talk to people in person.
Yeah, so social media is not the place to decide these issues at all.
Nearly everyone involved in the debate is intelligent, reasonable, and cares about Bitcoin. And so if you just talk in person or talk in longer form communications, that can be really helpful. I hope the community takes that lesson, because there will be big debates and fights in the future. And to the extent that the discourse can be good, and to the extent that people don't assume ill intention of each other, that will help Bitcoin incredibly.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I'd say that my main regret, if I have any, is that I didn't do more outreach before to talk to people in person and see what people were thinking. I didn't realize that there was, that this level of contention would actually arise. And I wish I'd just spoken to more people in person earlier.
All right. Are we through, Naomi, or is this, we can keep talking as well, I guess? All right.